Hi guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the education section. So this video is going to be on maximising quad development. Pretty much going over how exactly you can get the most out of your training when it comes to training your quads. So first of all, we need to understand the anatomy and the role of the quads. Pretty much just a bit about the muscle to understand how exactly it works and its role basically, so that we can ensure that our actions are in line with that. So pretty much your quads comprise of the rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and your vastus intermedius. And without kind of overcomplicating it, a good way to look at it is you've got your rec femoris, and also the other muscles in the quad. That's all you really need to break them up into, because you're not going to do an exercise and think about, right, this exercise is for my vastus medialis. You're not going to do a movement for every single part of your quad. However, you train your rectus femoris slightly differently than other muscle groups in your quad. The reason being is your rec fem, or I'll just basically refer to it as that from now on, which is your rectus femoris, crosses over the hip joint. So instead of attaching to like the top of your leg, it crosses over the hip, across the hip joint. And what that basically means is hip extension will influence the length of the muscle, and it's also got a role, like the quad's main role is to extend the knee, but also to bend at the hips, to basically flex at the hips, because it crosses the hip joint, if that makes sense. So that when we're training part of the quad, we'll train a bit of it more if we're in a flexed hip position, due to having more leverage for one of the parts of the quads. And basically your quads will originate at the top of the hip joint and insert below the knee, except from the rec fem, which will cross the hip, if that makes sense. So that's why when we're doing things like a leg extension, we'll work our rectus femoris more, because we're bent at the hip joint basically. And obviously, since our quad attaches on below the knee joint, that's basically why it plays a part in knee extension. Because if you think about it, or basically straightening the knee, in other words, because if you think about it, if you've got, let's say the muscle goes here to here, and this muscle gets shorter, then it's going to pull on that bit below the knee, which is going to mean your leg is going to straighten. So what does that mean in practice? What that basically tells us is when training the quad, what is happening at the knee is the main focus during the movement. That's what we want to be concerned about for the most part. And we want to focus on getting as much knee flexion as possible on things like squats, leg presses and lunge patterns, just because that will mean we'll take our quad through a full range, get a good stretch in that muscle. And your quads are a muscle that do respond well to basically being stretched under load. They are a bit more, there's a greater likelihood of it kind of having value in that position. Some muscles basically benefit from being trained in the lengthened position more than others. Your quads are one that are, or if you want the fancy word, they respond well to stretch mediated hypertrophy. But you don't need to know that. All you need to know is the quads benefit from getting a good stretch in them. So we want to make sure we are doing so by getting as much bend at the knee as possible. And to fully shorten the rectus femoris, which is part of the muscle in your quad, or one of the muscles in your quad, you want to ideally perform leg extensions to fully shorten that muscle group, so that we can train it when we're flexed at the hip while our knee's straight, which will fully shorten that muscle. It makes sense if you want to kind of maximise growth of a muscle. You want to train it in different ranges, meaning you don't want to just do like the same movement over and over again. We don't want redundancy. We want some variation, so we're kind of covering all our bases, if that makes sense. And as for exercise selection when it comes to training your quad, you want to pick movements where you can get a lot of knee flexion and you can stay relatively upright. Granted, it's not a machine. And what I mean by that is like things like a barbell back squat, barbell front squat, Smith machine squat are some good options that you will be able to maintain or where you have the kind of the importance of maintaining upright positions there. Whereas when you're doing things like a hack squat, a pendulum like in this photo, you're not really having you don't have the role of kind of staying upright because you're fixed into a machine, so you're not going to be able to really influence your torso position an awful lot unless you purposely try to. And you've also got the V-squat machine, which is just like a squat machine where you want to ideally stay upright as well. Because if we are bent over excessively, when we're bent over during a squat, there's going to be more challenge to the lower back, more challenge to the glutes, and potentially less challenge to the quads as a result of that. So we want to stay relatively upright so we can keep that challenge on our quads. And each movement has its pros and cons when it comes to like what compound movement you perform. There's not one movement that is going to be absolute best. There's, like I said, reasons why one movement might be more superior than the other. The benefit of maybe doing a movement like a pendulum or a hack squat is you're in a more stable environment, so stability won't be the limiting factor. And in terms of leg presses, so leg presses challenge the quad more in the middle position of the muscle length, sometimes the lengthened range, sometimes the stretched position, with more stability at the hip. What I mean by that is when you're training the quad during a leg press, you aren't worrying about what's happening at the hip and upper body. All that's kind of locked in, so you've got less joints to manage, whereas in a barbell back squat, you've got to worry about what's happening from the shoulders or where the bar is on your back to the hip, whereas all that's kind of locked in, set in stone when you're doing a leg press. So it's a good opportunity to really load your quads without getting much lower back loading at all. And like I said, a leg extension I think is kind of pretty much essential or close to essential, just so we can train the rectus femoris, the shortened position, for complete development. I'd say it is essential. And as well as obviously having like a squat variation, having a leg extension, a leg press, I think a split squat variation or some sort of lunge can be really valuable as well, just for working on how stable you are. And what I mean by that is the more stable we are, the more weight we can lift, the more force we can produce. A good example why is imagine trying to fire a cannon from a canoe. You're not really going to be able to produce much force. In other words, it's going to be a nightmare. The canoe's going to go all over the place. What I'm basically trying to say is if we are stable, we can produce more force. So if we do movements that challenge our stability, when we are in a more fixed environment, like a hack squat, like a pendulum, like a leg press, stability will be, we don't have to worry about that at all. We'll be super stable, which means we can get a lot out of that movement. And it means things like barbell back squats will be the same, and Smith machine squats, stability will be very good on those, just because we are used to challenging stability. I'm not sure if you've ever seen videos of anyone like on a leg press and they've got a lot of weight on it and their legs are almost shaking, and not just on the last rep but throughout the set. Like, that just does not look safe, and I don't think that's going to be like a good position to be in, and I don't think that's going to be a good position to be in to get maximal kind of stimulus out of your quads when you can't even stabilize your legs during like a leg press, for example. So in terms of like executing exercises when we're training the quads, we want to ideally, like I said, get as much bend at the knee as possible to train our quad for a full range. We also want our knee travelling over our toe, and the reason being is that will basically mean we've got tension on our quad. If we're doing, let's say, a leg press or a squat pattern and our shin is completely vertical, then and we've not got our knee travelling over our toe forward, then we've not got maximum tension on our quad. We will be training our quad, there'll still be a challenge there, but if your quad's a weak point, we definitely want to make sure our setup is effective and have our feet as low as possible. Even if that means using less weight, that doesn't mean less tension on our quads. The two aren't basically the same, if that makes sense. More weight doesn't mean more tension on a desired muscle. And when we're doing any sort of like just basically compound movement for our quads, where our foot's in contact with ground, we want to make sure all parts of our foot have pressure distributed in them. And what I mean by that is we shouldn't have all our weight on our heel or on our toes. We want our pressure distributed throughout all parts of the foot, potentially slightly more towards our big toe and that part of the foot. And what that basically allows you to do is get better depth. Give it a try if you haven't already, but basically the reason being is we've got a bone in our shin called the tibia. It will allow that to internally rotate inwards basically, which means your femur, your thigh bone, will externally rotate, which means you can get an appropriate amount of depth. Sometimes people don't struggle with depth due to maybe how they're built